On-screen text. The growth of electrical industries has caused a great demand for copper. More than 100,000 men are employed in copper mining. Arizona possesses the greatest copper mines in existence. Aerial view of the Grand Gulch Mine. A masonry chimney. On-screen text. National Park Service, National System of Public Lands, U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management. Grand Canyon-Parashant National Monument.
So we're out here in the middle of nowhere, what some people would call the middle of nowhere. Others would call it the middle of everywhere.
The historic Grand Gulch Copper Mine, established 1873. National Park Service archaeologist Greg Woodall stands in front of stone ruins.
Desolate as it may seem, people have been living here for thousands of years, long before the historic copper mine, and thriving out here, passing through the area, traveling through this area. We have prehistoric routes, travel ways, and the Southern Paiute people, this is their homelands.
Petroglyphs. On-screen text. Nampawit.
Shivwits Paiute, they've been out here, they'll say, since time immemorial. We've been here forever.
Vein of copper ore.
And it was actually a Southern Paiute individual who showed the copper ore, the first piece of copper ore, to the earliest people who were looking for copper on the Arizona Strip.
Wooden structures. A masonry chimney. On-screen text. Smelter. Constructed 1878.
The earliest mining efforts were in the late 1800s, and copper mining is a real boom and bust business because the price of copper depends on the national market or the international market. So you'll see a copper mine going big business, and then it'll just bust. And then it'll start up again next time the market gets real good for copper.
A low stone building. On-screen text. Bunkhouse. Constructed 1907.
And at its peak, there were anywhere from 30 to 80 people working here and living here. The real boom was spurred on by World War I, the need for copper then, and the electrification of America, basically.
Women assemble bombshells. Electrical appliances from the 1920s. A mine tunnel.
When you're actually in a mine tunnel and you're trying to get ore out, typically what you're doing is you're trying to break it up, which usually means drilling holes into it and then blasting it.
A man hammers on a rock drill.
Early mining was all done with hand tools. Hand drills, where you're just slamming on this thing with a sledgehammer, either a single jack or a double jack. Basically just means one or two heads on the thing. It's what we call hard rock mining, and that's a real good description. Very hard rock, very hard work.
Dynamite is packed into a rock wall.
Drilling the hole, putting in the blasting powder, and then blasting the rock out so you can then haul it out.
Men fill an ore cart.
Ultimately, they did develop mechanized drills. There you could drill the holes a lot quicker, but the amount of dust generated in doing this, in this hard rock mining, you end up with ailments later in your life. White lung, they call it. The dust gets in your lungs and just kills you ultimately. 500 feet below the ground is a network of tunnels for getting the copper ore out of the ground.
Building timbers in a mine tunnel.
To keep those tunnels intact, you had to shore them up with timbers. The timbers came from the mountains east of here, which coincidentally was where the timbers for the Latter-day Saints Temple in St. George also came from.
A tall white church. On-screen text. St. George Temple, completed 1877. Greg Woodall in front of the smelter.
My grandfather actually came over from Italy and worked in coal mines in northern New Mexico, and that was his job, was to put in the safety timbers, the shoring, and keep the mine safe.
A mule pulls a train of ore carts underground.
And you had hoists to bring the ore up out, rails to move the ore to where it could be hoisted out. Sometimes, depending, you'd have a mule actually pull in the ore cart coming through.
A horse tethered to a hoist above ground.
And the earliest hoists were, again, horse-powered or mule-powered to pull that to the surface, and then later they did go to mechanized hoists.
wooden mine buildings, and a timbered tower. On-screen text, Grand Gulch Mine hoist, 1918 photograph. A large rusted metal wheel.
Mines are really enticing and intriguing, and people want to explore them, but they were dangerous back then, even with brand new timbering and shoring and people working to keep them safe. Now all those timbers are rotted or burned out, fallen down, collapsed, so definitely not a safe place to be.
Fallen mine timbers.
When it comes to a mine, stay out, stay alive.
A barren desert. A team of 20 mules pull freight wagons.
Once you get the ore to the surface, then you have to get it where you can process it. And so the early days, that was burro loads or freight wagons. Ultimately, they went to mule trains with wagons, and tremendous cost because we're in the middle of nowhere here.
A dry wash.
Back then it was bam, 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 mile after mile, and you could literally find old wagon routes by bits and pieces that fell off. The wagons literally were falling apart.
Dirt roads lead to cliffs.
You can still travel what was a prehistoric route, a historic route, this mine route, the ore route. You can travel that now in the comfort of a Razor or a UTV or a pickup truck.
A truck drives below sandstone cliffs.
And if you break down out here in the summertime, you're gonna know real quick just how brutal this place can be.
A desert oasis and palm trees.
Going across with the wagon trains, you would go spring to spring, maybe you literally have to stash grass or hay for the mules to eat along the way because, again, hot stinking desert. There's not that much out to eat out there. You just got to keep moving kind of thing.
Historic graffiti on a sandstone face.
You can see where the old wagon train would sign in on the rocks with axle grease.
A rocky desert wash. Historic photographs of mule teams pulling freight through canyons.
Tremendous amount of effort. Get across the desert through tight canyon narrows, and then the final obstacle of crossing the Virgin River.
A calm river.
Which, on a good day you splish splash on across. On a bad day you end up washed away. And the irony of drowning in the desert. And all just to get to St. Thomas, Nevada, where it can be loaded on a train.
Ore processing and smelting.
Then it would go by rail to Salt Lake City, Utah, where it would be processed.
Greg Woodall sits on an ore pile.
So that ore is still there, sitting right there in St. Thomas, Nevada, waiting to be loaded on the train. You can go there and visit it. It's a Park Service interpretive site and Lake Mead National Recreation Area.
Copper ore litters the ground. On-screen text, ore unloading platform, St. Thomas. Weathered rail ties. Historic photograph of horses and wagons on a tree-lined street.
Imagine what it was like all those years ago, living there, working there.
Building foundations.
You can walk the streets, look at the old buildings, and imagine living in the desert there. Tremendously hot in the summertime, surprisingly cold in the wintertime. A lot of these desert towns, these little farm towns, their nicknames sometimes are more illustrative of the real life conditions. There's one called Lick Skillet. In other words, you didn't have much left over. Never Sweat. And that, of course, is a sort of a satirical comment on just how hot it is.
Building foundations. On-screen text, Gentry House. Historic photographs of a large brick building. On-screen text, St. Thomas Schoolhouse. Building ruins. On-screen text, St. Thomas Schoolhouse.
So the town's days were numbered.
Historic photograph of the schoolhouse in water.
The newly constructed Hoover Dam flooded out the community. The rising waters of Lake Mead put the town in a watery grave.
Historic aerial photograph of floodwaters over a town. On-screen text, Lake Mead floods St. Thomas, 1938.
However, now with fluctuating lake levels, you can actually see the community as it's been resurrected and exposed by the lower lake water levels. The old buildings here at Grand Gulch Mine really tell the human story
Greg Woodall and the historic bunkhouse.
of this place. Bunkhouse, mess hall, cookhouse, really let you think about how it was living here once you got out of the mine, the hard work of the day. First you had to get clean. Some places they would actually have like a shower house or a bath house where you could get cleaned up.
Historic footage of miners eating lunch underground.
A lot of times, if you didn't have that much water, you just kind of wiped yourself off and went on about your day after that. The artifacts on a historic site, the cans, the bottles, those will tell that story as well.
Aerial view of mine ruins and dump trucks. On-screen text. Headquarters. Constructed 1900.
You find toys on historic sites, and then that gets you thinking, okay, there were kids here. What is the story behind each and every artifact?
Shaker tables. On-screen text. Ore sorting. 1918 photograph.
So what were people eating here? Well, the artifacts, the tin cans and the bottles down the slope, they would tell us. Were they drinking cocoa? Were they drinking tea? Were they drinking coffee? Those tins are going to be down the slope there. They'll tell us that story. And because you had wagons going to St. Thomas hauling ore, well, when they would come back, they wouldn't come back empty. They'd get fresh produce from the St. Thomas farming community.
Mules pulling freight wagons. On-screen text. Harvey Frainer and Big Team, 1930s. Farm machinery. On-screen text. Farming in St. Thomas. Workers in a field. On-screen text. Paiutes picking radishes near St. Thomas.
The melons from St. Thomas were a real treat out here in the middle of nowhere. If you needed beef, they had an arrangement with the ranchers where when they needed meat, they wouldn't go to the butcher. They would just shoot a cow out here, butcher it out here, pay the rancher after the fact.
A cow walks through sagebrush. Flowers and ruins. A canyon. Rusted machinery.
So even though this mine's in the middle of nowhere, holidays were important. There's a newspaper account, 1912, of the big Thanksgiving dinner hosted by the mine superintendent. Everybody had a great feast.
Rusted dump trucks. On-screen text. Euclid truck, 1950s.
Christmas time and the old areas around here, a real treat was getting a Christmas orange because they had to be purchased so far away and traveled so far, and you got your very own special Christmas orange.
1918 photo of canvas tent cabins in the snow.
There was a community here. It wasn't just miners in the middle of nowhere. Women were prohibited from working in or even entering the mine, but they were still here, and they fulfilled traditional roles, mending clothing, cooking, and cleaning.
Bunkhouse interior.
There was a Paiute woman who was the cook, Susie Pulsifer, I don't know her Paiute name, and her two little girls were here with her.
Partially ruined stone building. On-screen text. Blacksmith shop, constructed 1900.
So one would expect to see toys out here.
A man stands in front of a canvas tent cabin.
Same thing, nice hair pins, that sort of thing. So it's like, even though you're in the middle of nowhere, you're still living. You're still wanting to enjoy things. So when you visit historic sites, it's the artifacts and the buildings that tell the whole story. Real important to look at things, but don't disturb them. Don't destroy them, don't take them. Because the next person, they won't be able to get that same story. The information will be lost. Everything's protected by law on historic sites, and we need to respect the past, preserve it for the future.
For travel information to the Grand Gulch Mine, visit nps.gov/PARA/plan your visit. National Park Service, National System of Public Lands, and the U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management, Grand Canyon-Parashant National Monument. National Park Service, Lake Mead National Recreation Area. National System of Public Lands, U.S. Department of the Interior, Bureau of Land Management, Gold Butte National Monument.